Hey guys, this is Paul from Passion Consulting, Scrum events. So let's cover this. Obviously, the Scrum events are very important to make sure that we have certain time boxes, certain amounts of time dedicated to particular tasks that are going to help the team to be more productive and to deliver that increment of the product. So the first thing I'm highlighting here is the definition as usual. Prescribed events are used in Scrum to create regularity and to minimize the need for meetings not defined in Scrum. All events are time-boxed events such that every event has a maximum duration. So what this is saying that made me want to highlight it is the fact that what we're trying to do is minimize the need for any other meetings. If you deal with any team, particularly software development teams, but most teams, to be honest, most teams of people who are focused on delivering pieces of a product, if I'm really honest, the last thing most of them want to do is be in meetings. Probably the same may be true for you. But essentially, knowing that the team are there for a specific purpose to deliver the increment, what we want to do is we want to remove anything that is taking them away from doing that. One thing that's going to take them away from doing that is being in a meeting. So what Scrum does, and I think really does very well at doing, is provides the minimum set of meetings necessary to make sure that they've inspected, as in they've looked at what progress they made since last sprint, they've adapted, they've planned, they've thought about everything they need to do to build that increment of the product or to improve that increment, and nothing else. So it provides just the events that you need to do that. So that's what this section here is talking about, and I thought that was really key in industry and for the exam to draw your attention to. All events are time box events, such that every event has a maximum duration. All that's saying is that, as you'll see in the Scrum guide, there's a maximum duration for every event, and the fact that they're time boxed is very key. So unlike a lot of other methods, frameworks, processes, Scrum as a framework is really explicit about the amount of time you should spend planning. And that comes both because of the experience of the founders of Scrum, who some of which were team leads and project managers, among other things. So partially on their experience, and partially because there should be a limit to things. You shouldn't allow meetings or the amount of time you take to build a product to go on forever, because as human beings there are limits to our attention spans, and there are limits to the amount of time that you can spend before you become unproductive anyway. So that's very key. The next one, and this is something I've drawn attention to earlier, so I won't say it again. I'll say it again, but I won't draw too much attention to it. Failure to include any of these events results in reduced transparency and is a lost opportunity to inspect and adapt. And elsewhere it actually says, if you don't have these events, if you're not doing all of this, you're not doing Scrum. However, what this is saying is that it's really giving you the reason why you're not doing it. You're reducing, and I'd go as far as to say greatly reducing the transparency and greatly reducing your chances to inspect and adapt by leaving out any one of these. So if you're just having a stand-up, how are you going to plan things? How are you going to plan the next sprint of work? If you're just doing planning, then how are you going to keep the team coordinated from day to day? So these have been really meticulously thought about, guys, and every single one of these events plays a role. This one's excellent. The heart of Scrum is a sprint, a time box of 1 month or less during which a done, usable and potentially releasable product increment is created. That's really interesting that Ken and Jeff have called this out as the heart of Scrum. And it makes a lot of sense, because the whole point of what makes Scrum, and to be honest, agile methods in general, but particularly Scrum, different, is the emphasis on the iteration, which within Scrum is called a sprint. And the reason it's the heart of Scrum is because you've got a specific amount of time that you've agreed as a team, as a Scrum team, after which you will be creating a usable piece of the product. And that's powerful, as you've learned in the video, because with previous methods such as waterfall, that wasn't the way things were done. You would wait till the very end of a project. The project was not split up into smaller pieces. So if you had a huge product which would take months to build, you wouldn't get any value from that for months. A new sprint starts immediately after the conclusion of the previous sprint. So that's just something that I picked up from one of the exam questions that I thought it was good to draw your attention to. So if you are in a sprint and you have begun the sprint, you've had the retrospective, well, let me put the meetings to one side and the events to one side. The key thing here is that however you run your sprint, whenever you have your meetings, as soon as you finish the sprint, you are now starting to use time from the next sprint. So if you have your planning meeting, your retrospective, as many people do, your retrospective, your planning, your review, and everything all in one day, that day is the beginning of the sprint. And when you finish and you complete the increment of the product, and you finish on a designated day, such as 2 weeks later, the sprint ends, the next time when you go into planning on the next morning, you've begun the sprint already. So that's really key in terms of managing your time. And it's also really key in terms of the certification to understand when that finishes. I've definitely seen at least one question on that. Each sprint is considered to be each sprint may be considered a project with no more than a 1 month horizon. Pretty much speaks for itself. Sprints are limited to 1 calendar month. Again, I've seen questions around these, and just you need to be careful thinking about the fact that how many days it is not necessarily the focus. The focus is that it needs to be less than a calendar month, whatever you decide. Cancelling a sprint, only the product owner has the authority to cancel a sprint. So that's just something I thought I'd draw your attention to, because it's something in industry I think people may think it's the Scrum Master, it's actually the product owner. Sprint planning. So what I've done here is I've highlighted the amounts of time that these events can last for as a maximum. Now, obviously you reduce those times based on the length of your sprint. So sprint planning is time boxed to a maximum of 8 hours for 1 month. And I found that, even though this doesn't say explicitly, I found that 2 weeks, a 4-hour meeting works for 2 weeks. Now, for a 2-week sprint. Now, that may sound a large amount of time, and it is a large amount of time for a meeting. My advice would be to have breaks. So it is that long because there is literally that much to talk about. And this is something you may have found already, or you will find, is that there is literally that much to talk about when you're planning. But in terms of reducing it down, I have found that roughly half the time, and you can get it quicker, but I found that in the beginning stages at least, for a 2-week sprint, it's 4 hours. For a 1-week sprint, it's about 2 hours. It may be a bit more than that. So I just thought I'd highlight that point. So here we have an example of something that changed. This is talking about within sprint planning, the way the sprint planning event actually works, the sprint planning meeting actually works. In the video, you would have heard Ted referring to 2 halves to the meeting, the what and the how. Well, in the July revision, as I told you, there were some changes, and one of those changes was that Ken and Jeff made the change from prescribing that there are actually 2 halves to the meeting to saying that there are 2 topics that need to be covered in that meeting, just to give some more flexibility and not to tie it to there being 2 explicit halves in that meeting. So the first topic, it's still the same points, is the what. So you're planning what needs to be done, and that focuses the team around specifics of what needs to be done. And the second topic is how will the work get done, and that's usually the how is where the team would break down into tasks. So I just wanted to draw your attention to those 2 changes. I've mentioned 2 halves to the meeting because that's still usually how it's done. However, the key thing here from the Scrum Guide is that there are 2 topics in this meeting. The input to this meeting is a product backlog, the latest product increment, projected capacity of the development team during the sprint. So this is a technique I usually employ, which is to work out how much time do the development team have. And there are various methods for this. The method I employ is to go around the team of experts and, without dividing the team, get all of the experts to work out how much time they need, how much capacity they have, bearing in mind all of the meetings they usually have, and some of them may be meetings outside of the sprint, but including planning sprint review and all those things, how much time they need for other things like lunchtime. May sound like a strange thing, but factor that in. Factor in anything you do in your working day, guys, because if you don't, it will usually come back to bite you as something you haven't planned for. So once they've worked out how much time they take, even factor in toilet breaks, because that takes time, but factor in everything that you need time for in a sprint. And then whatever's left over is your capacity. And what that does is it builds buffer into the plan. So I've highlighted this because, and this is covered on my blog and other places, for which I'll leave you a link at the end of the course. But what this does is it builds buffer into your plan, so that if you work out, actually, even though you've got 10 working days, one whole day is used for planning. There's roughly, I don't know, this is just a number plucked out of thin air, 7 hours of that working week is used for meetings and other things that just come up. So you work out you actually have less time than you thought you had, because you've got 9 days really after you take account planning. And if you take off the 7 hours, you've actually got 8 days worth to plan for. So that's just an important point I thought I'd draw from the point of view of both the certification and everyday life. Sprint goal is an objective that will be met within the sprint through the implementation of the product backlog. So I just thought I'd draw attention to the definition of a sprint goal. Again, here's the definition of a sprint goal: an objective set for the sprint that can be met through implementation of the backlog. The daily scrum. So the daily scrum is 15 minutes time box event, and that time box is so important because, as I've said, the team being in meetings, this is all about the team, right? This is all about making the development team as productive as humanly possible. And being in a meeting for 15 minutes is a fairly small hit on the team. And if we make sure that we coach the team, as a Scrum Master, you coach the team to understand the value of keeping things short and sweet, and they will understand it. It's fairly difficult at times, depending on the personalities you have in the team. But this is something that's really key to driving the productivity of the team. And when they really get used to keeping it under 15 minutes, they will really thank anyone that coaches them to do it. Daily Scrum is held at the same place each day. I've drawn attention to that because it's an example of an exam question, just to drive the importance of that. And the key thing that came up in one of the exams was that it was to reduce complexity. And that might seem pretty strange. Overheads and complexity, I believe it said in the exam. That might sound like a strange thing to say about a gathering, but what they're saying here is that by keeping the location of the daily scrum the same, it's one less thing for the team to think about. If you think about it, having to think about where the next meeting is a good enough reason for somebody to be late. It's a good enough reason for someone to miss the meeting because they were looking for the room. And given that this is a daily event, the last thing you want is key people from the team missing that event. So reducing the complexity just means it's less for the team, the development team, to think about. Here are the 3 questions. And another change that was made in the July revision of the Scrum Guide is that rather than what did I do yesterday, it's also what did I do yesterday that actually helped the development team meet the sprint goal? What will I do to help the development team meet the sprint goal? And do I see any impediments that prevent me or the development team from meeting the sprint goal? So this is just tying all of the communication in the daily scrum to being about the sprint goal. As we know, there are many things we do with our days, and what we don't want to do is waste any time talking about things that aren't helping us to be productive towards the sprint goal. The next point is drawing attention to the fact that Scrum Master, one of the Scrum Master's roles is to ensure that the development team actually have the meeting. But the team are actually responsible for, if the Scrum Master's away, to really take the reins of this and make sure it happens. So the Scrum Master plays a key part in making sure that this meeting takes place. However, the reason I'm drawing attention to this is A, I've seen it in the exams, I've seen it questioned in the exams, and B, because it's really interesting that although the Scrum Master has authority over the, coaching the framework, we're really leaving it to the development team to make sure that they do the right thing. They know the rules of the game, they know what's in it for them, and they know how it's going to help them. And it's down to them really, if the Scrum Master's away, to really take the reins of this and make sure it happens. The fact that the Scrum Master wasn't there on occasion shouldn't be a reason for them not to have the meeting. On to the sprint review. So what I've highlighted here is the fact that during the sprint review, the Scrum team and stakeholders actually collaborate about what was done in the sprint. And based on that, any changes to the product backlog during the sprint, based on that and any changes to the product backlog during the sprint, attendees collaborate on the next things that could be done to optimize value. So what this is really saying here is the sprint review is a chance not only for the stakeholders to see what was built in the previous sprint, but to actually feed into what goes into the next sprint. Because the stakeholders are exactly that. They have a stake in the outcome of the project. And therefore, them gathered with the team and the product owner is the perfect opportunity for them to feed in to what they need, or to raise any questions or queries that they have. And this is something to watch out for in the exam as well, is the role of particularly the stakeholders and how they collaborate with teams. This is a 4-hour time box meeting for a 1-month sprint. So again, similar thing to the planning meetings. Every one of these events should have a specific amount of time. And that amount of time, the maximum amount of time, is very important. It's very important not to go over that. And it's very important that you reduce the time in proportion to the sprint, as it says here. For shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. The sprint retrospective. So again, I will not go into what the retrospective is, but I just again am highlighting the time limit, the maximum time limit. So that's it, guys, for this section. As usual, I hope you got some value from that. Remember, I'm really drawing your attention to things that are examples of the type of questions that you will get in the open assessment and thus in the final certification exams. The reason I'm drawing things out in these presentations is partially because of that, and partially because these are also, incidentally, the kind of things that people get misconstrued in industry, such as the length of meetings. And really understanding this and really being on top of your game on these points are going to set you apart. Trust me, from my experience, they're going to set you apart from others in industry. Because, believe it or not everybody's read the Scrum Guide, and not everybody knows the importance, really, of these underlying things. So I really hope you've got value from this, and I will see you in the next section.